All right, everybody, here we go. The Lovers. I promised I had some interesting things to say about this card, and you can bet I do. This is not a series about hot takes, although a lot of what I've said in the series may have felt like that. It's not really the point, but I will admit that when I talk about this card in workshops, this is the card where most participants wonder if I've lost my marbles or question my ability to actually read, because I have some strong feelings about this one. I'm going to share them with you now, and as I do as a Tower Chariot, I tend to send things tumbling down, right? This card, as a concept, has never made any sense to me the way it's traditionally interpreted. And when we look at what's right there in front of us, I can't really get behind the idea that this card is a card about choice. I do not think this card has anything to do with choice. In fact, I think it has the exact opposite connotation. I'll explain why. Love is not a choice.
Loving you is not a choice, it's who I am.
People don't fall in love on purpose, we fall in love by accident, and usually it's against our better judgment. We don't fall logically in love, we fall helplessly in love. It doesn't make much sense, and a lot of us would probably avoid it if we could, because sometimes it's such a pain in the neck. Love happens slowly or it happens fast, but rarely does anyone ever say, well, I think I'm going to fall in love with this person. I think I'm going to choose to fall in love with this person. I mean, I'm sure it's possible, but it's not something that happens very often, at least in my experience. We're simply introduced to someone or something, and suddenly we realize we're attracted to it. Some of us may feel like, oh, this is all, what? Oh my God. And sometimes you just sort of wake up one day and it's there. But it's not usually something people choose to do. Many of us, I'm sure, have had times where we realize we're in love with something or someone and we wish we weren't because, I don't know, they're bad for us, they're unavailable to us, they're not worthy of us, they don't reciprocate the same feelings, or worse, they're just taking advantage of us. For a lot of folks, nothing makes us feel more mortal than falling in love because it requires us that we come to terms with the inevitability of loss. You know, whatever way, whatever happens, somehow we will lose people we love or they will lose us, and there's nothing we can do about it. And so in a way, it's kind of surrendering to the inevitability of impermanence, which is just sort of terrifying a lot of the time, you know, especially if you have any kind of anxiety about mortality. You know, all we can really do is try to be present in the best parts of those feelings, the best parts of those moments, and enjoy it while we can. But it certainly makes you feel sort of unsettled and weird and oh my God. It's not pleasant all the time. In fact, you know, when you're thinking about like the love stories that are told in the world, we only really get to see the good stuff, you know, the Disney version of it. But what you don't really get is the depression, the anxiety, the fear, the wondering whether you're safe, all these sort of uncomfortable mortal feelings that we feel when we have to surrender part of our willpower to feeling something caring towards another person. It's just sometimes unpleasant and even downright painful. Even if we take away the idea of loss, we know that there's an inevitability that we're going to be hurt by or disappointed by the people that we fall in love with, and that we are going to hurt and disappoint them as well. I don't know a single person who's ever had a romantic relationship where feelings were involved, that they didn't at one point wish they were a sociopath, so that they didn't actually have to feel the things that loving requires them to feel. You know, sometimes we wish we could just turn that off and be sort of a robot and not have to feel anything towards this other person. I'll say too that I think it's totally possible for people to love things as well as other humans. And I know that's not sort of a popular way of looking at love, but I think often it's not the object so much as what the object represents. It can remind you of another person or just something you've achieved, something you've gotten in life that you wouldn't have been able to get before. I think it's a very human thing to put power behind objects. Certainly, I mean, if we think about tarot decks for a lot of folks, they have sort of a endowment of power, a sort of anthropomorphized magic to them. They have a livingness, and people really love their decks. And so I think it's not out of the realm of possibility to say that people can love things too. And so I'm not just talking about people, although certainly it's easier to lose a tarot deck than it is someone you care about. But I think the whole idea here is just love generally. All right, so how did we get here? How did we get to this idea that the Lovers card represents choice? And I should recognize, too, that the name of the card is not love, it's the Lovers. In fact, in the Old French deck, it was the Lover, singular. I think, from what I can tell, that a lot of this idea of choice in part stems from the fact that in the Marseille decks, the early French decks, the card seems to depict a male appearing, presenting figure choosing or standing between two female presenting figures. And the idea being that he is choosing between these two. Some people say it's a mother figure and a wife. Some people say it's two women. Some people, everyone's got different impressions of the card. But the idea is that here's this person choosing between two different women or two different people who they are going to love. That's what the card shows. Except that's not what the image shows at all, because there's a major detail that stands out on this card that is kind of central to the whole thing, and it's the fact that Cupid is there with his arrow. That image right there describes exactly what I was talking about earlier, the concept that we have a complete and total lack of choice when experiencing love for someone. The story of Cupid's arrow exists because humans needed a way to explain how we fall in love and why it appears to be so out of our control, so random, so inexplicable. The second that arrow hits the character, all choice goes out the window. The character is going to fall in love with whoever's standing right in front of them. And Cupid is blindfolded, so he doesn't even know where he's aiming. So it's not like there's intent there either. You just get struck by the arrow and that's it for you. There's no choice in that. So this is my typically long-winded way of explaining why I disagree with basically everything everyone has always said about this card. But it just doesn't make sense. I think that, again, when we look at things as they are, when we look at things at their root, at their essential self, it's very difficult for me to understand the idea of choice in a card that, first of all, represents loving or lovers, where we know that love is not something that happens on purpose. We know that it's not something that one chooses to do and that many of us would avoid it if we could. And also that the card doesn't really depict what it appears to depict. We can't escape the main image there of Cupid shooting that arrow blindfolded right into the guy's ass. He's going to fall in love with whoever he's looking at. Now in the Waite-Smith deck, and this is probably my least favorite trump card in the Waite-Smith deck, I do not like this version of the Lover's card at all. It makes no sense to me. Anyway, it shows Adam and Eve, presumably pre-sin. But there's nothing about the Adam and Eve myth that suggests choice in particular either. I mean, I guess you could argue that Eve chooses to eat the apple, and then Adam chooses to eat the apple, and then that results in a consequence. And I think choices and consequences are very interesting concepts. But Eve was tempted. She didn't do it because she had the impulse to do it. She did it because she was talked into doing it. She was manipulated into doing it, right? And so even there is the sense that it's not quite her choice. She listened and was convinced to do it. And again, I mean, there's a little bit of agency there, but I just don't see it. And I guess you could argue that Adam chose to name the names of all the animals, but that doesn't really seem to be the kind of choice we're talking about. So even that depiction of the card has never made any sense to me. And it just feels kind of typically Golden Dawn-ish to just indiscriminately change it to the Garden of Eden because it's a mystery tradition and it's the Golden Dawn and Waite does Waite and nobody does Waite better than Waite does Waite. There's a tongue twister for you. So this is all by way of saying that contextually when we're looking at the card, it seems to depict the exact opposite of what we've been told that it depicts. And I'm not asking you to change your perception at all. Look, it has worked for people, for generations of readers. As I have said time and time again, for me, it's not so much that you change the way you read or that you agree with anything I say, but that you're willing to think contextually and that you're willing to kind of break down preconceived notions of the cards in the context of a reading so that you can better understand how the card is functioning and maybe get a clearer answer that you might not have gotten. So yeah, I mean, I'm being kind of iconoclastic right now just for the sake of it, but I also do think that when we start with where the card is in the world and what it's really showing us, then aside from just being more contextually clear, it just helps us to remember what it means, if you start with the idea of being a lover, of loving, then you get this different interpretation that really seems just more clear to me, more like life, you know what I mean? More like what's going on in the world and how we move through it, which is kind of the whole point. Now, I will concede one thing about the idea of choice in this card, and maybe it will help justify it for you if you're really clinging to the older notion of the card, is that if we remove the romance aspect from it, the loving aspect of it, and we think about a lover as a sexual partner, I think in that case, choice does make sense, right? Because people should consent to be sexual partners. So there should be a choice there. Two people choose, or more people choose to be sexually engaged with one another. And so in that way I can see it, but that's not depicted in any of the cards. So it's, or any depiction that I've ever seen of it. And so it's a little tenuous thing, but like, if you feel like you need my permission to read it that way, then, there you go. Lovers should choose each other sexually, and there should be consent in that act. So there's one way to look at it. So anyway, everyone's wrong about this card, and I'm right. You're welcome. I'm joking. It's not that big a deal, really. It's just funny to me. It really is. I mean, just sort of from an amusement standpoint, just sort of looking at this card as I have over the years. Like, one of the things that got me where I am as a reader is that I really had to sort of question everything I've been taught and everything that I thought I was looking at in order to sort of understand how the card functions in real life. And in doing that and really understanding the Lover's card, I said, whoa, this is like the exact opposite of what I thought it meant and how I had read it for a long time. But that's one way to think about it. There are many others. So let's look at some other ways you can think about the card too. So because the title of this card is The Lovers, or like I said earlier in the French version, The Lover, it can really represent anyone who loves anything, the act of loving, the act of caring about something, so it could be any person, place, or thing that we're really talking about. That card in a reading could suggest you really need to love it. For example, if you're looking for career advice, like what should I do in my next job, and the Lovers comes up, it should probably be something that you really love, something that you're really passionate about, or something that makes you feel loved, an environment where you feel loved, or that is mutually beneficial in the way that lovers should be. Do you know what I mean? And so in that sense, there's this lovely little kind of lovely lovers, this lovely little sort of simpatico connection of like really caring about something that you're doing as a career or anything, you know what I mean? Like, where should we go on vacation? You should go to a place you really love. Or, you could take it in different directions too, depending on context, to a place where you fell in love, to a place where you can rekindle your love, like whatever that is. But the idea of being a lover of something can really be useful in readings in some cases. And definitely a way of looking at the card that I think is really practical and really down to earth and kind of less sort of floofy than the idea of like choosingness, which again, never really made sense to me. But again, it's fine. Everything's fine. I have, in readings, a lot of the time actually interpreted this card simply as partnership. The way that the ring in Lermont can kind of represent partnerships and deals, especially when paired with a card like the letter. So it's not just romantic partnership, but partnership in general. So business deals, handshakes, that kind of thing. I think it's useful, again, especially in terms of just sort of practical day-to-day stuff. You know what I mean? Like if you're trying to achieve a goal, sometimes you need a partnership in order to do that, or you need a collaborator or a peer. Some kind of partnership. And that is a really practical way that the card has showed up for me in a lot of readings, regardless of what's depicted on it. So sometimes we can take just the idea of lovers and then say, well, what is a loving relation? What is a lover relationship at its core? And it's a partnership. So, you can sort of literalize it in that way. And that happens a lot in readings for me. With all the majors, but I think that that's a really good example, and it's a really practical one. It's very sort of tarot on earthy sort of thing. And I love to think in terms of card combos and how cards sort of work together and dance together and like heighten themselves or restrain themselves, contain each other, and change the meaning and make them more specific. In the video on the Hierophant, I talked about how that card can represent intensity and ecstasy. And certainly if you were to pair it with the Lovers, you can really kick that up to 11, right? There's going to be this really intense kind of ecstasy there because the Lovers sort of has that natural passion as part of loving something, and then there's the intensity and the ecstasy, the power of the Hierophant in that way, if you read it that way. And certainly if you were to pair the Lovers with cards like the Tower or the Ace of Cups or the Ace of Wands, there's a really kind of explosive passion, sexual power there as well. I know I talk a lot about sex in these videos, and maybe some people think like, why are you so obsessed with sex? I'm not really. It's just, again, it's a thing that is part of life. It's a thing that people care about. It's one reason why people want readings. So, seeing relationships in cards, in ways that maybe are more physical than we're used to seeing the cards, I think can be really, really helpful. You know what I mean? If you have the Lovers surrounded by a lot of Wands cards, this may be a very physical relationship, but there may not be anything to ground it if there's no coins, for example. Do you know what I mean? Or if it's surrounded by a lot of swords, it may be very intellectually stimulating relationships that we're talking about, or combative relationships. You know what I mean? There are people certainly out there who kind of get off on hate sex, which Again, we won't go down that road, but you know what I mean, I hope. I just don't sound like a whole weirdo, which, let's face it, I am anyway. But if you were to pair the Lovers with Temperance, that could really kind of water it down a little bit, right? Tamper it down, make it less passionate, less intense, and so it could be meh feelings, or it could be just sort of normal, like taking for granted sort of way relationships change, but Temperance can really sort of even it out and make it less dramatic, less sexy, less overwhelming even. And certainly, certain cups cards could do that too, and then when you think about the numbers, if you have like aces around it, twos certainly. So aces are the beginning of something. Twos have this attractive and repulsive quality to them. So you could have like the Lovers and twos being like really attracted to each other, but really early in the relationship. As you climb higher, the eights could make the Lovers feel like this is just work. This relationship has just become work. And then the 10 could signal that it's really over, especially the 10 of Cups, where like it's the emotions have just kind of run out. So there's that too. The pairings like that to me are super fascinating, and I find so helpful in readings, especially relationship readings, of course. You know what I mean? But like you get the point, but it doesn't have to be just relationships. If a partnership is ending, a collaboration is ending, the 10 could signal that as well. So there's some ways that like combos really make the cards sing. And this is, I'm such an advocate for like reading with more than one card. 3 cards is, I think, a perfect number, especially if you're a beginner. But even if you like do that 9-card box spread that I love so much, like that's really just a series of 3-card readings that you just sort of layer and bring to an answer. It's still really powerful stuff. And the relationships between the cards changing is so fascinating to me. It's like, it's art, it's music, I love it. And as always, context, right? Like if you're doing a reading about your boss, unless you're sleeping together, probably it doesn't suggest anything romantic. It might suggest, in fact, that you guys need to find a way, I should say, you folks should find a way to partner better. You have to find a way to kind of be on a more even playing field, which is difficult in some work relationships. And you can take it further, right? Like I always say, the more context we have, the easier it is to be clear. So if it's not just that you have conflict with your boss, but also that your boss inherited you and is kind of resentful that they didn't hire you and they're stuck with you, then it might be that it's because they didn't get to choose you. If you go back to that idea of choice, being part of the meaning of the card, right? So the conflict may have to do with the fact that they didn't get to choose you. They were sort of forced to have you on their teams, which, I've worked in corporate America a long time. It certainly happens, and, there's oftentimes very little you can do about it. It's not healthy if people can't resolve their egos that way. But it is worth considering the way that lack of choice can play in readings. I think it is an interesting thing that we don't talk about a lot in tarot, because so much of modern tarot really has the self-empowerment kind of self-fulfillment thing, and I think that's great, but like there are times where we just don't get choices from things. There are times where we don't have agency, and the cards that help us see when we're not in control can really help us understand situations better, and it can even stop us from blaming ourselves for things that we can't fix just because we want to. You know what I mean? I think it's helpful to know sometimes, and I really like spreads that include a situation where it's like, what's not within my power to fix, what's not in my control right now, because it's helpful to know what obstacles you're up against that are overcomeable, but also those that aren't, and I think it's really, really helpful to consider that too. Like, when do we lack agency? And if there is a situation where we lack agency, are there things we can do to get agency again? Sometimes it's possible, sometimes it's not, but I think it's really helpful in reading for others, in reading tarot in modern life, that we have an understanding that not everything can't be solved by positive thinking. You know what I mean? We can't just spiritual bypass our way out of things sometimes. We have to wrestle with the reality that they are, and that we don't have control over them. So that is my talk about the Lovers. I hope that it inspires you to think differently about the card. I hope you didn't shut me off halfway through. But again, I think looking literally at the cards, I'm like, what am I really seeing? Especially when you're stuck, can unlock some things for you. And that's what happened for me with the Lovers card, was that I was like, what am I really looking at here? What does the experience of being a lover really feel like? And then I realized, like, oh, whoa, it's not always a choice. In fact, it's rarely a choice. It's like, oh, fuck, I have feelings for this person, you know what I mean? And it's a whole nightmare sometimes. I mean, it's just that way it goes. It's being a human sucks sometimes. So there we go. Next week we're going to talk about the Chariot. Probably will be one of the shortest videos, because sometimes something is just what it is. But still interesting nonetheless. Hope you're doing well. Take care. Be good. And we'll talk soon.